So thank you so much. My name is Marleen Onwezen. I work at Wageningen University. And today I'm going to talk about the consumer perspective. And I would like to start with posing a question to all of you. And you need both hands. So all laptops, phones need to be laid down. The first hand, please raise your hand showing how you intend to be a sustainable person. So think about flying, consuming meat, all the things you want to do, you aim for. How sustainable of a person do you want to be? I'm just waiting until I see all hands. Yeah. Thank you. Leave this hand, leave this hand. Now use your second hand. And now show how sustainable of a person you are. Is it the same? Is it a bit less? Far less, even more. That happens not that often, but yeah. This gap is what we refer to as the intention-behavior gap. And that's one of the mechanisms which is truly interesting about consumer behavior, because there are a lot of contrasts and paradoxes going around if you're talking about consumer behavior. And today I want to take you a bit along in how we approach that and provide you some of the examples of interventions we do. So what we see is that this gap is also happening for the beef burger. So just think about this burger as a 100 grams of burger. And we already know for decades that these burgers are associated with a lot of CO2 emissions, which equals like 16 kilometers of driving. A month of showers, about 6 or 7 minutes a day to produce this burger. 2.5 kilos of animal feed, and all kinds of food-related diseases related to too much red and processed meats, not talking about the animal issues yet. Of course, we learned that you should, today that we should look at more detailed about these impacts, etc., but we know on average that these meat consumptions have enormous impact. But if we're talking about the behavior of consumers, there's not much happening these past decades. We see excessive amounts of meat consumption in the Western world, far exceeding the nutritional recommendations. And these production numbers are rising steeply in the past decades. We see a bit of a stabilization on this moment, but still these numbers are steep and high. So if we're talking about the consumer perspective, we are talking about how can we support consumers to change their diets. Talking about how we change consumer diets being full of animal-based proteins, meat and dairy, like milk and cheese, going towards novel proteins like insects and cultured meat, and also plant-based analogs and non-processed proteins like beans and pulses. And what we see is that at this point, there's talked much about it, but the behavior is not so much changing yet. Consumers are not having a full plant-based diet, not even partially, so there's a lot of support needed. I'm going to skip this one. And what we see is that this intention-behavior gap is also really happening at this point. So on the hand of the green part of your brain, you're making all these deliberative decisions, thinking all about the pros and the cons, and deciding what kind of person you want to be, what kind of values you think are important. On the other hand, you have the purple side of your brain, and that's very much influenced by the environment and having all these impulses and intuition and thinking about running through the supermarket, having 3 kids with you, and just deciding whatever comes in your supermarket. So, in essence, we're often talking about the consumer from the green perspective, thinking about providing more information and just explaining that it needs to be changed. But we need to include the purple perspective also to truly change consumer behavior. And that's essentially what my work is all about. I'm not going to detail into this, but what we do is trying to understand why consumers behave the way they do and use these mechanisms to truly support behavior change. And today I want to provide 4 examples of studies we did just to provide you some of the ideas of the things we do. So the first one is diving a bit deeper in this intention-behavior gap. So one of the studies we did is we asked consumers what their acceptance of various alternative proteins is. For example, fish, seaweed, pulses, and insects. So you see a bit of variation. You see that seaweed and pulses are more accepted and insects are far less accepted. And you see a bit of change. So consumers become more and more acceptance of these alternative proteins over the years. We're going to replicate it this year, so I'm curious what happened the past years. But what we also did, we asked about the behavior and also compared that across the years. And we then see that there's nothing changes. So on the one hand, consumers become more open. That's a positive message. And it's also, you can really think that through. There's much more attention, there are more alternative products, it's more like in the mind of consumers, but the behavior is not changing yet. And also, if we do the analysis, we can see that only 30% of behavior is explained by these intentions. So far more is going on if you're talking about behavior compared to your intentions. So then talking about some of the interventions we do. You obviously have different consumer groups. So in this case, we differentiated between 4 different consumer groups. You obviously have consumer groups who are indifferent. They just don't care that much about animal welfare or the environment, and they also do not experience the negative emotions. You have a coping group. They already changed their behavior. So for example, these are the vegetarians, but also flexitarians or organic meat consumers. You have a struggling group. These are not deciding yet. They are experiencing negative emotions, and they're trying to cope with that, so they're trying to change something. And the last group I want to talk today about is the strategic ignorant group. This is a very interesting group. This group is, on the first hand, looks like an indifferent group, because they state that they do not want to learn more about animal welfare issues. They don't want to learn about it, they just want to barbecue because they love meat. But this group is very interesting, but because in essence they do already have these values. They really care about animals. They really care about the environment. They just think it's very complicated. And what they decide to do is to shut their eyes and shut their ears and do not want to learn more about it. And what we try to do in this experiment is, can we do something with this group? Because these values are already present. They already think it's important, but they just don't act yet. So we did an experiment in a zoo, and in the canteen of the zoo we hang all kinds of posters in different weeks. So we could compare the weeks afterwards, which was most effective. I'm going to ask you beforehand which week you think has the most impact. So in the first week we asked consumers, what do you think about animal welfare? We just posed a question, just to try to trigger those values, but we just openly questioned it. And in the second week, we really went for the route of easy and price. So we really highlighted that it was an easy option, that the price was equal, and in the final week, we did both at the same time. So who thinks the first week has the most impact? No one? It's always a bit tricky, or no one sticks up his hand, but who thinks the second week, so easy and price? Already see a lot of hands coming up? Yes. And the third week, so both of them? Only a few. Okay. So what we saw is that even the week before, we had no promotion material, so that's the baseline. We saw 4.7% of the burgers being a vegetarian burger. If we only pose the question, what do you think about animal welfare? The amount of vegetarian burgers doubled. Just only asking a question was enough to double the amount of burgers. And we did not see any additional significant effects, so the 6.5% is not significantly different for the easy price condition. And the combined condition shows that it is truly the value activation. And I think this is a very elegant example, because we're always talking about price, and we're always talking about price promotion, taxes, etc. And at some instances, it's also important to think about how you can trigger consumers in the values they already have present, and that you can like really trigger change. This is a doubling of the amount of vegetarian burgers by just posing that question. The third one, so the food environment. I first want to talk about the study in which we try to explore how sustainable behavior, and in this case meat reduction behavior, relates to all kinds of goal frames individuals have. And just to explain a bit about that, you have different goals activated at different moments. So at some points you're very much related to price, sometimes you're really thinking about pleasure on this moment and taste. Moral values is more about the environment and animal welfare, and social is about the others around you. And obviously, it's not that all these values are always present at the same time. So sometimes, if you're a consumer in the supermarket, then other values might be triggered compared to being at home. And we try to disentangle that. So we show, first of all, how sustainable behavior relates to these values. And we see, it's not a surprise at all, that it very much relates to moral values. So sustainable choices very much relate to moral values. But then we looked at which values are activated by the current food environment. So for example, the supermarket, the out-of-home settings, restaurants. And we checked which values are triggered on this moment by these food environments. And then we see that especially hedonic values and gain values are activated. At this moment, if you walk to the supermarket, you're very much price activated, and you're very much activated in thinking about taste and pleasure on this moment. And that makes sense to some extent, but you can really think about ways to also activate these moral values, so you can really change the food environment to support these more sustainable decisions. And I'm providing just one example of a study we did in which we changed the food environment. And in this case, we changed the standard. We did an experiment in a restaurant, and we changed the menu of the month. I think, yeah, this menu is in Dutch, so you cannot read the white parts, but it provides an idea. And in the first week, we had like the menu of the month, and in the first week, the chicken wrap was the standard option. And if you wanted, you could choose for a beans wrap, but you had to ask for it. And in the second week, we turned that around. So then the beans wrap is the standard option, but if you want to have chicken, it's okay, you just have to ask it. So in essence, you have the same options, you just have to ask it. And in week 3 and 4, we did the same thing, it's exactly the same, but then with seaweed, because it's a bit more out of the comfort zone of the consumers. And what we saw is in the first week, most of the consumers chose for the chicken wrap. And in the second week, it truly turned around. So then the standard option became the beans wrap, and then most of the consumers choose the beans wrap. And we saw the same thing happening for seaweed, which is even more out of the comfort zone choice for consumers. So you think you make all these decisions by yourself, really deciding which is most tasteful for you at the moment, but you're very much influenced by the food environment. And these small things, keeping the freedom of choice for the consumer, can really change the choices which are made. And the final examples about unconscious affective routes. We did a study in which we tried to explore which drivers are most relevant to explain intentions to buy seaweed, pulses, fish, all kinds of alternative proteins. And we saw that the motives of food choice, which are most often mentioned, like health and convenience and price, were the least predictive of intentions. And attitudes, behavioral control, and food neophobia were quite important to explain the intentions. But the most relevant ones were the factors which are unconscious and which are never debated if we are talking about why are consumers not choosing for my products. And that's why the social environment. Individuals are very much influenced by what other people do, and what they think that other people think they should do, and the emotions, so the emotions that are triggered by these products. And we use this in a study in which we compare different burgers which were included with insects. And this is only a part of the experiment. We included all kinds of insect products, ranging from insects as feed compared to whole fresh insects and all the sorts in between. And what we varied was the message. So in essence, we just compared very similar burgers. They look the same ingredients, and we only changed feel good about yourself and choose this product, and research shows and choose this product. And what we saw is that it is especially the feelings which really assure that people, or which really make the products more attractive for the consumers. And this even more happened, so the more insects were included, the more fresh, the more scary the product became, the more important this emotional message becomes. And we really tend to try to explain it to consumers and use a very technical message. But what we see in this research, that it's also very much about the emotions you try to induce by consumers. So wrapping up, consumers seem to state, at least, that they are willing to change, though they really need support to act. And we can use all these paradoxes and difficulties to develop knowledge rules to support consumers towards different consumption patterns. And what I've shown today is that there's an intention-behavior gap. So that consumers on the one hand can state that they do things, but that's not always the way they act. And it's very important to keep that in mind when approaching consumers and when developing your strategies. I showed that it's important to differentiate between consumer groups, and for example, that it can be very valuable to approach the ignorant group by just activating the values, by just asking them the questions that really activate what they already find important. I showed that the food environment can be a very important trigger, and that by just changing the standard option, you might already change behavior. And the last example, I showed that unconscious affective roots are also very important to support consumer choices. And that was it. Thank you very much.